$12. That was what they said. Clem Darrow owed the trading post. $12 in unpaid credit, $12 in feed and flour, and 1 winter's worth of promises he never kept. And when Clem Darrow couldn't pay, he offered the next best thing he had, his daughter. The girl stood at the edge of the porch, outside Hester's General Goods in the town of Coldwell Crossing, Montana Territory, on a Thursday morning, in late October of 1879. She was 22 years old. Her name was June, not Junie, not June Bug, just June. Her mother had been clear about that before she died, and June had held on to it the way you hold on to the one good thing left after everything else burns. She stood with her wrists loosely bound with a length of hemp rope, not because anyone thought she'd run. There was nowhere to run to, not with 2 feet of mud between her and the nearest road, but because Clem liked the theatre of it. He liked the way it made people stop. It made Rook stop. He had come down from the ridge for salt, and nothing else. He came to Coldwell, crossing maybe 3 times a year, and each time he timed it to avoid the crowds, avoid the noise, avoid exactly this kind of morning, where men gathered around a porch railing and laughed too loud and passed a flask between them like it was a celebration. He was a big man, not tall in the way that made people look up at him, but wide and dense, the kind of big that came from hauling timber and skinning elk, and spending 11 winters alone above the tree line. His name was Rook. Just Rook. He'd had a last name once, but it belonged to a version of himself. He didn't recognize any more, so he'd left it somewhere around 1868, and never went back for it. He pulled his horse to a stop at the hitching post and sat there a moment watching. The girl wasn't crying. That was the first thing he noticed. The men around her were talking about her like she was a length of rope they were considering for quality. And she was standing there, looking at a fixed point somewhere past the mountain ridge, her jaw set, her eyes gone somewhere else entirely. She had 1 boot with a broken sole that flapped slightly when the wind moved it. She had mud on her collar and a bruise along her jaw that was 4 or 5 days old, gone yellow at the edges. Clem Darrow was a wiry, red-faced man with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. He was talking to 2 miners from the Bitterroot camp, explaining the terms like he was selling a good mule. She could cook, she could sew, she was strong enough for outdoor work, no trouble in her. He said that last part twice. No trouble in her. Rook climbed down from his horse. He told himself he was just going inside for the salt. He got as far as the bottom porch step. $12, Clem was saying. That's all. $12, and she's yours to take north for the season. You bring her back in spring or you don't. Makes no difference to me. Rook had $12.40 in his coat pocket. He'd been saving the 40 cents for coffee. He didn't think about it the way a man thinks about a decision. It happened the way things happen when your body knows something your brain is still arguing about. He stepped forward, reached into his pocket, and set the money on the porch railing between Clem Darrow and the 2 miners. He said, "That covers the debt." Clem looked at the money. He looked at Rook. He looked at the money again. Then he laughed and said, "Well, she's all yours then, mountain man." Rook didn't look at Clem again after that. He reached over and worked the knot on the hemp rope until it came free, and he dropped the rope in the mud, and he said, without looking directly at the girl, because he wasn't sure what to do with her eyes on him, he said, "You ride or you walk?" She looked at him for a long time. "Walk," she said. "Good," he said, "because the horse doesn't like passengers." She walked behind him for the first mile. He didn't tell her to. She just did it, the way someone does when they've learned that walking behind is safer than walking beside. The road turned to trail, and the trail turned to rock, and by the time the last buildings of Coldwell Crossing disappeared behind the ridge, the cold had come down hard, off the mountain like it always did this time of year, sudden and without apology. Rook noticed she wasn't wearing a proper coat. She had a wool shawl, thin and damp at the shoulders, and the broken boot was audible now, slapping the ground with every step. He reached into his saddlebag without stopping and pulled out a canvas work jacket, worn through at one elbow, and held it out beside him as he walked. She didn't take it for almost a minute. Then she took it. He didn't say anything about that. The trail up to his cabin took 2.5 hours in good weather. Today was not good weather. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind was coming sideways off the northern ridge by the time they cleared the aspen grove below the upper meadow. The girl, June, he reminded himself, her name was June. He'd heard Clem say it without any kindness in it. She had stopped limping somewhere around the second switchback and had gone instead to a rigid, controlled kind of walking that meant she was past limping and into something worse. He stopped the horse. He said, "Get on." She said, "I'm fine." He said, "I know you're fine. Get on anyway." There was a long pause. She got on. She sat behind him without touching him, her hands gripping the back edge of the saddle, and he could feel, from the small movements of the horse beneath him, how carefully she was balancing, making sure not 1 inch of herself pressed against his back. He said nothing about that, either. The cabin sat on a south-facing slope, about 4,000 feet up, tucked into a stand of old ponderosa pines that broke the worst of the north wind. It was not a pretty cabin. It was a functional one, low-roofed, heavily chinked, with a stone chimney Rook had rebuilt twice after bad winters, and a small outbuilding where he kept the horse and his trapping equipment. Inside, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping platform along the far wall, and shelves of canned goods, dried meat, and equipment, arranged with the particular order of a man who lived alone and didn't want to be searching for things in the dark. June stood in the doorway and took it in. He watched her, briefly, the way you watch someone walk into a room you've built with your own hands, not looking for approval but noticing it anyway. She said, "Where do I sleep?" He pointed to the sleeping platform. He said, "I'll be in the outbuilding." She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, not through him like she'd been doing most of the walk up, but at him, like she was trying to read something written in small print. She said, "That's not necessary." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean, I won't." He said, "I know that too." She closed her mouth. He went out to see to the horse. The first week was mostly silence. This didn't bother Rook, who had spent 11 years perfecting the art of it. He wasn't sure how it sat with her. She wasn't a woman who filled silence with noise just to cover it, which he respected. But he also couldn't tell if the quiet was comfortable, or simply the silence of someone who'd learned that speaking didn't help. She cooked without being asked to, and she cooked well, which surprised him, not because he doubted her, but because his own standard had dropped so low over the years that anything seasoned with more than salt tasted like an occasion. She kept the fire banked through the night. She mended the split in the cabin's east-facing window frame, using a strip of rawhide she found in the outbuilding, without asking if she could use it. On the 4th day, he came in at dusk to find she'd reorganized his shelves. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She was sitting at the table, and she looked up, and there was something in her face. Not defiance exactly, but a readiness for defiance, like she'd been expecting a reaction and had already prepared her response. He looked at the shelves. The canned goods were grouped by type now instead of by size. It was, objectively, more logical. He sat down and said, "Supper ready?" She blinked. Then she said, "Yes," he said. Good. That was that. By the second week she had stopped positioning herself near the door every time he came into a room. He noticed when it happened, and he didn't draw attention to it. He'd learned, in the years before the mountain, that attention could ruin a thing that was fragile and forming. You let it be. You kept your hands to yourself and your voice level, and you let trust grow the way things grow at altitude. Slowly, sideways, without any drama, she started asking questions on a Sunday, small ones at first. How long until the first hard freeze? Whether the North Trail ever cleared before March? Why he kept 2 sets of traps in sizes that didn't match? He answered them all without turning them back on her. She'd answer things when she was ready, he figured. She'd been carrying the weight of her own story for 22 years, and he wasn't about to ask her to set it down on his table, just because he was curious. But one evening when the wind had come up bad and they were both inside, her with a strip of leather she'd been tooling into something, him with a section of damaged trapline, she said, without looking up. "He sold me for $12, Rook said. "I know," she said. He owed 15 at the trading post, actually. He pocketed the other 3. Rook was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sounds like him." She looked up. She said, "You know my father," he said. "Knew of him. Men talk, even men who don't like to." She looked back down at the leather in her hands. She said, "He sold my sister 2 years ago. Different man. Different town. I don't know where she is." Rook set down the trapline. He said, "What's her name?" June said, "Addie." He said it again to himself, quietly. Addie. He didn't make a promise. He wasn't a man who made promises he couldn't guarantee, but he picked up the trap line again. And he filed that name in the same place he kept the things that mattered, and she must have understood something about that, because she went back to her tooling. And they sat together in the bad weather and the wind, and neither one of them said anything more. The leg happened in the 3rd week of November. He'd gone out early to check the upper line of traps before the weather turned. There was a smell in the air that morning he didn't like, the specific cold, wet smell that meant ice was coming fast. He should have stayed lower. He knew the north-facing slope above. The granite outcrop was treacherous after a rain, and he knew it every morning, and that particular morning he'd been thinking about the broken rivet on the number 4 trap instead of watching his feet. The ground went out from under him at the edge of the outcrop. He fell 8 feet and stopped hard against the base of a lodgepole pine. He knew before he tried to stand that the leg was bad. Not broken in the clean way, but broken in the complicated way, the way that sounds different and feels different, and sends a very particular message from your bones to your brain that says, "This is going to be a problem." He lay there for a moment. The sky above him was the same pewter color it had been for 2 weeks, and somewhere up the ridge a raven was making the sound ravens make when they found something interesting, which he did not appreciate. He made it back to the cabin in a little over 3 hours. Later, he would not be able to remember all of the 3 hours clearly. He remembered the cold ground and the smell of pine sap, and the way the light changed, and did not change. And he remembered at some point being on the lower trail and seeing the smoke from the chimney above the tree line, and moving toward it the way you move toward the only fixed point in a spinning world. June heard him before she saw him. She was at the woodpile, and she came around the side of the cabin at a run, and she got under his arm without a word, and took enough of his weight that the last 40 yards to the door didn't kill him. Inside, she took one look at the leg and went very still. The kind of still that isn't fear, but is the opposite of fear, is the thing that takes over when fear would be useless. She said, "Sit down and don't move." He sat down. She said, "I need to straighten it." He said, "I know," she said. "It's going to hurt a great deal," he said. "I know that too." She straightened it. He made a sound he wasn't proud of. Once. And then he didn't make any more sounds, because she had moved to the shelf, and was pulling down what she needed with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done hard things before, and he didn't want to give her any more trouble than she already had. She splintered the leg with 2 straight sections of ash from the kindling pile and strips of listen from an old shirt she cut without asking. She made a poultice from what she found in his medicine box. He wasn't sure how she knew what she was doing. He didn't ask, and she kept the fire high all that night. He woke in the dark at some point, and she was in the chair beside the wood stove, not sleeping, just sitting with her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm and her eyes on the fire. The wind was bad outside, ice against the window. He said, "You should sleep," she said. "I will." She didn't. Not until dawn. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Rook's life, and he had lived a strange life. He was a man, built for movement, for the trail and the ridgeline and the long work of a day in open air, and being confined to a sleeping platform with a splintered leg in a one-room cabin tested every quiet instinct he had. He was not good at stillness. He was not good at needing things. June was, it turned out, very good at giving without being asked. She ran the traps. He tried to explain the line to her on the first day, and she listened with the complete attention of someone who is memorizing, not just hearing, and on the second day, she went out and came back with 3 marten and a fox, and a look on her face that wasn't pride exactly. It was the look of a person who has discovered that they are capable of something they didn't know about themselves. She managed the firewood and the cooking and the horse, with no complaint and no performance of complaint. She kept the water bucket full. She read to him from the 3 books he had on the shelf. A surveying manual, a collection of frontier correspondence from the 1840s, and a worn Bible. And she did not comment on the oddness of his library, which he appreciated. On a slow afternoon, when the weather had let up enough to see the high peaks, she sat at the foot of the sleeping platform and said, "Tell me something about this mountain," he said. "What kind of something?" she said. "Anything true." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "In spring, the snowmelt runs down the east drainage, and it's the cleanest water you'll taste in your life. Cold enough to make your back teeth hurt. There's a grove of larches above the upper meadow that go orange in October, not yellow like the aspens, orange like a fire. In June, the wildflowers come up so thick you can't walk through the upper meadow without color on your boots for a week." He stopped. She said, "June," he said. "What?" She said, "My name, you just said it." He said. "The month or?" She smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it did something to the quality of the air in the room. She said, "Both. It's the one good thing my father ever did. Named me after something that comes back every year, no matter what." Rook looked at her for a moment. He said, "That's a good way to think about a name." She had the coin the whole time. He found out in February, in the way that mattered most. She told him. She had been to Coldwell Crossing once in January, on a clear day when the lower trail was passable, to trade some pelts and get news of the territory. He hadn't asked her to go. She went because the supplies were running low, and because she was June, and June didn't wait to be told, to do a necessary thing. She came back with flour and coffee, and a small paper parcel of sugar, and she set them on the shelf, and said nothing about the trip, and he asked nothing, because that was how they had learned to be. But in February, on a night when the cold had come down to the kind of temperature that made the timbers creak and pop, she came to the table and set something on the surface between them. He looked at it. It was a double eagle coin, $20 gold, so worn it was almost smooth. He said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "I've had it since before Coldwell Crossing." He waited. She said, "My mother gave it to me when I was 16, sewed it into the hem of my skirt, told me it was for the day when I needed to go and there was nothing left to hold me." She said, "Don't spend it on anything less than your whole life." Rook looked at the coin on the table. He said, "You could have left. Any time?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Even before the leg?" She said, "Yes." He let that sit for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, something, a branch, a shift of snow, cracked loud off the north eave. He said, "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. Not through him, not past him. Directly at him, the way she'd been doing since somewhere around the 3rd week, the way that still occasionally caught him off guard. She said, "I kept waiting to want to." He was quiet. She slid the coin back across the table toward herself, held it in her palm, and looked at it for a while. Then she said, "The ledger between us. Whatever you thought it was, I'm closing it. You didn't buy me. You don't own a person, Rook. You just paid a debt my father owed the world, and you didn't ask for anything in return. So the ledger is closed," he said. "All right," she said, "but I want to ask you something." He said, "Ask it." She turned the coin over in her fingers once. Then she looked up. She said, "When spring comes, and the larch grove goes green again, and the east drainage runs cold, do you want me here?" Rook had never been a man who said things easily. Words had always felt like more trouble than they were worth, most of his last life. And he had come to the mountain partly because the mountain didn't require them. But June was looking at him with that direct, reading look, and she had just handed him the most honest question anyone had put to him in 20 years. And he understood that this was one of the moments that hinged, that what he said next would mean something. He said, yes. She nodded once, slow, as if she'd been expecting an answer, but not necessarily that one. She said, then I'll stay. She closed her hand around the coin. Spring came late that year, as it always did above 4,000 feet. The snowmelt held in the high draws well into May, and the east drainage didn't run clear until the last week of the month, but when it finally came down off the rocks, it was exactly what he'd described. Cold and fast and clean enough to make your back teeth hurt. June knelt at the bank and put her hands in and gasped at the cold and laughed, and Rook stood upstream with his fishing line and listened to the sound of it. His leg had healed, crooked. He walked with a slight drag on the right side that the cold mornings made worse, and he knew it would never be entirely right, and he found he minded it less than he expected. It had healed. He had been taken care of in the healed, and that was not nothing. That was, in his experience, rare. She had sent a letter to the last known address for her sister Addie in March. A town in the Gallatin Valley a man named Fenwick had mentioned passing through. There had been no answer yet. He didn't tell her to stop hoping. He didn't tell her that either. One morning in late May, he came out of the outbuilding at dawn to find her sitting on the step with a cup of coffee, watching the ridge go pink with the early light. She said, without turning around, the larches are starting. He looked up at the high slope. She was right, the very first green of the season, pale and tentative, threading through the grey of the old branches. He sat down on the step beside her. After a while, she handed him her coffee without asking if he wanted it. He took it. The ridge went from pink to gold, to the hard blue of full morning, and somewhere in the upper meadow, the first meadowlarks had started up, and the mountain held them there on that step, two people who had each arrived at this place by the least likely road imaginable, and made no particular distinction between them. That was the spring the ledger closed and something else began. Something that didn't have a name yet, and didn't need one.